Damar Hamlin is, it appears, going to make a full recovery. He was the Buffalo Bills safety who collapsed 1 week ago, in fact, a full 1 week ago, on Monday Night Football while playing in a game against Cincinnati Bengals. And almost immediately, there was a discussion about what might have caused his collapse. And this is important, Buck. I didn't really get involved in what might have caused the collapse. We didn't talk about it a great deal on this show because I wanted to make sure that first and foremost he was going to be okay. That's the number one story coming out of any injury, is the person going to be okay. Now that we know he's going to be okay, what caused his collapse becomes a very important story. Back in 1990, Buck, a man named Hank Gathers, basketball player for Loyola Marymount, collapsed during a game. He was going to be a lottery pick, and he died on the court, basically. Loyola Marymount went on to the NCAA tournament. Bo Kimball, some of you will remember, memorably shot his free throw left-handed in honor of Hank Gathers, even though Bo Kimball was right-handed. It's an iconic story from the NCAA tournament that many of you are familiar with. Well, they looked into why Hank Gathers collapsed, and as a result, all over the country in a high-level college and certainly professional sports, it became commonplace to examine as best you could the heart health of your players to try to ensure that there was no other Hank Gathers. And there are countless individuals probably who have continued to survive because of what the fallout of his collapse.
Hank Gathers did have a congenital heart issue, right? That was what they found. So it was a rare but identifiable condition that unfortunately led to the tragedy.
That's right. And so it was important. And now, basically, every major college athlete and every pro athlete for sure goes through a heart screening to ensure that their heart does not have a condition that could lead to their collapse and untimely death in moments of athletic endeavor when you are using that heart to its utmost. It's important, and it's been very impactful. Same thing needs to happen with Damar Hamlin. And almost immediately, in addition to people who started to ask questions about why Damar Hamlin might have collapsed, you notice something chilling. A huge argument that you weren't allowed in any way to ask if this might be connected to COVID shots. Because we are seeing a lot of heart-related issues in young, healthy people. And there was a conversation over the weekend between Dr. Fauci and this guy from CBS Sports. And he asked Dr. Fauci directly about the impact of the COVID shot on hearts. Here is what Dr. Fauci said, play cut 24.
Yet again, another conspiracy theory, complete nonsense, is going to have some people make a decision for themselves and their family not to get vaccinated, which may cost them their lives. So that's the thing that's so horrible about it. And if you want to go out spouting nonsense, conspiracy theories and spreading it all around, fine, except if it results in a person suffering and perhaps dying.
Okay, Buck. Fauci knows nothing about Hamlin's overall health prognosis. He's not his doctor. He doesn't know anything about him. Yet he feels comfortable saying you can't even suggest that something that has never occurred in the modern era in football, that is, a player collapse and nearly die on the field of a heart-related issue, could not be connected to the COVID shot. My question for you is, first of all, Buck, this is anti-science, right? Because you should consider the possibility of everything to try to ensure that, like the Hank Gathers situation, we never have another incident like this. But my biggest takeaway from all of this is when people say you can't bring this subject up, when people say you can't ask this question, those are the times when you most need to have the discussion and most need to ask the questions. And furthermore, this is just further anti-science behavior from Fauci.
If their position was strong and they actually knew 100% what the case was here, what had happened, wouldn't they want to take this as an opportunity to lay out why, if asking the question is wrong because they already know the answer, which is the implication, then the asking of the question should be something they welcome because it gives an opportunity to lay out their case for why it is not the thing that is raised by the question, in this case, in any way related to the COVID vaccines, right? But they actually won't allow the discussion. They won't allow the conversation to happen at all because their point is shakier than they want to admit. I'm not saying one way or the other. I don't know. I'm obviously not able to, I'm a doctor, not able to bring any specific knowledge of this case to the conversation. But then again, neither of the people saying you're not allowed to think about this out loud. And when you have a sports figure who has such this was obviously very traumatic for him, for Damar Hamlin, but there was a public trauma here too. I mean,
yes.
Our athletes are, first and foremost, they're fathers, sons, brothers, teammates, but they're also heroes to millions and millions of Americans. And for one to have something like this happen, I mean, the audience was people watching this all across the country, very affected by it. And so there is a public interest in what caused this, because if it is a safety issue, if there's anything that needs to be changed from a football perspective, which I don't think that's going to happen, but that's certainly a point of discussion, debate that could be had. But if this is a high-profile case, I mean, you'll notice they get very angry when anyone points out any time that one of these incidents happened that it could be related to COVID. Meanwhile, Clay, they used to say, don't even talk about myocarditis when it comes to these shots. It's reckless. There's no evidence for myocarditis coming from the vaccine. That was a lie. There is evidence, and people do get myocarditis from the COVID vaccines. So that's all. We've already seen that transition happen.
Yes. And I think we've got a cut about that where Fauci acknowledges it. But notice what they're doing now. They're trying to say, oh, well, the myocarditis might be caused by COVID, not the COVID shot. That's the pivot that they're trying to make now. Listen to that.
Some of the mRNA vaccines can cause a self-limiting, almost invariably benign inflammatory response in the heart, which generally resolves in a very short period of time. It is very, very rare. When you compare that with the negative effects on the heart by myocarditis or pericarditis, which is inflammation of either the heart muscle or the covering of the heart, and heart failure and heart medical problems, overwhelmingly COVID itself causes that in a dramatically higher rate than the relatively benign mild myocarditis that you might have with a vaccine, which is very, very rare.
First of all, where's the data? So now COVID causes heart
data.
Trauma in everybody? I want to see this. First of all, as we know, COVID is dangerous. We've known this in the beginning, to the elderly and the severely immunocompromised. And that is it. For everybody else, it's a cold. Okay, we weren't allowed to say that. Oh no, you can't. Clay, you've had it twice.
I've had it twice, at least.
Probably had it 3 times at this point. I mean, the fact that we're even still having to have this conversation, but we have to because they won't admit what is true, and they're still continuing on with a lot of this stuff. And the fact that they have to admit that there is myocarditis caused. By the way, I have had doctors tell me that I've spoken to about this because I was very curious. Myocarditis, when he says it resolves. If any, of course, the press or who was he sitting with there? I don't even know. It was on some
it's the reason why
CBS,
it's that
right?
the Major Garrett, I think, is the guy's name.
Unfortunately,
he's the chief Washington correspondent with CBS.
Journalists, unfortunately, are overwhelmingly much more concerned with their hairspray and their makeup situation than general knowledge. They're just, how does my voice sound? How does my hair look? So they don't know squat, but as a general rule, just always remember that. Most journalists are they're B- students from second-tier liberal arts colleges. I'm just going to say it. And the reality of myocarditis, according to some doctors that I spoke to, is that you can't really know because there can be some scarring that comes from the inflammation in that heart tissue. It can take a while to know what the actual long-term effect is. And so if a 16-year-old all of a sudden has some myocarditis inflammation of the heart, all right, maybe they'll be okay. It'll go away. Okay, fine. but do they have scarring that might affect them and make them more likely to get a heart attack in 30 years?
Yeah.
I mean, I would want answers to these questions, but you're not going to get that.
No, and I think that's what's so important here, Buck. Even Dr. Fauci acknowledges, and the difference, obviously, is people don't choose to get COVID. So if you get COVID and you have a negative health impact, that stinks, but you're not voluntarily choosing to do it. If you are young and healthy, there is no reason why you should have ever gotten the COVID shot. Just there isn't. And NFL players felt overwhelmingly, as did many pro athletes and college athletes, that they were being bullied into putting something in their body that they didn't need to keep them healthy. And so in the wake of this Damar Hamlin case, is it possible? This is just a question that I'm asking that I think is the essence of science. Is it possible that this COVID shot, in the event that he got it, could have created a situation where he was more susceptible to a heart attack from things that happened on the field than he would have been otherwise? That's the essence of science, right? Shouldn't we want to know that?
Right. I mean, so what you're saying is, and again, this is asking a question or posing a thesis, not claiming that this happened, but is it possible that you could get some degree, maybe even mild myocarditis? Because they're mild cases, but there's also what I said, which is sometimes there's scarring of the heart tissue that can occur. It depends on how it goes. If it was a mild case, though, even that level of inflammation, would it make it more likely that you'd be susceptible to the very rare commotio cordis, I believe, right? That's what they call it. Commotio cordis event where your heart is effectively hit at the exact millisecond that it causes it to stop. I don't know, but the public has a right to ask these questions and to be told these things, especially given the medical establishment acting like morons for over 2 years, saying masks protect us. We know masks work. No, they don't, Libs.
Buck, isn't this the very essence of science, to try to determine if there might be a causation involved here? We have never seen this happen on a football field before. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hits have taken place on a football field without a guy nearly dying on the football field. Now, if that is the case, it's not crazy to say, well, what has changed that we have required virtually every football player to do in the past year or so? We've required them to get the COVID shot and then get a booster. Something that even Dr. Fauci acknowledges can create inflammation of the heart. It doesn't seem crazy to me to say, could this have made him more susceptible to this incident occurring? And if so, how do we prevent this from happening to another player, high school level, college level, pro level? And or is there a significant threat that did not exist before COVID to younger athletes? Because I'm telling you this, Buck, I'm seeing a lot of stories about people dying of heart-related issues that are in their 20s, that are in their 30s, that doesn't seem to add up. And what I would like to see, and this is something for a lot of you out there, it's the biggest radio show in the country, I would love to see a detailed study on mortality rates for heart-related condition of people under the age of 40 in the last year or so compared to the historical record. Is this just an anecdotal thing, Buck, where we see these stories and they don't add up? Or is there something going on here that people don't want to acknowledge as it pertains to mortality rates from heart-related conditions for people in their 20s and 30s? That's data that's very important.
I think there's still debate, with so many great quotes. One of the frustrations about quotes is that you learn to love a quote, and then it turns out it's maybe he didn't ever really say it or wrote it, or it comes from some guy named Bob who lives in his parents' basement in Seattle, and you're like, wait, what happened here? But there is that quote about Einstein with 100 authors that came out against him with the theory of relativity, and paraphrasing, but Einstein's response to this was allegedly, why 100? It would only take one to prove me wrong. And there are variations on this as well. No amount of experimentation can ever prove me right, but one experiment can prove me wrong. This is kind of the heart of scientific method. Whether these quotes are somewhat mangled or apocryphal or not is irrelevant to the point that we're making here, which is that they lied to you and they keep lying to you and they're not going to stop.
Damar Hamlin's going to be okay, But the fallout of exactly what happened to him, you're not allowed to discuss, according to Dr. Fauci. Well, we've got a couple of doctors, nurses rolling in who want to share their opinions with you. Let's go first to Dr. Frank down in Lubbock, Texas. What is your background, doctor, and what did you think based on what you have seen of the Damar Hamlin incident?
Yeah, I'm a retired neurosurgeon. I'm not a cardiologist, but I had that game on and I saw it. The thing that bothers me about commotio cardia or cordis diagnosis is I don't believe he would have enough cardiac output to stand up for, a couple seconds and then fall again. If he truly went into a dysrhythmia, upon contact, I don't think he would have been able to get off the ground initially.
Okay, that's an interesting point. You're a former neurosurgeon, retired neurosurgeon. What do you think about Dr. Fauci saying you aren't allowed to even mention the COVID shot or a potential impact on this incident in any way? How does that strike you as a doctor?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. Unfortunately, the medical field has fallen in line behind him and basically thrown out all the tenets of science that we've all learned over the years on how to approach something. You don't jump at a diagnosis, especially, and again, I don't have the information on Mr. Hamlin, but you don't jump on something. You cast a broad net, keep your mind open, consider all the possibilities. It's called a differential diagnosis, and you go from there. And so blocking things out for, in this case, political reason or otherwise is just it's bad medicine. I don't know anybody would want a physician like him, the way he's handled things.
Hey, Doc, as a neurosurgeon, are you troubled by the prospect, based on the numbers that we have seen, that the vaccines may have had certainly more side effects than we were initially led to believe or even really allowed to believe?
I think it's very concerning, but what concerns me even more is the medical profession turning into a bunch of sheep.
Yeah,
I think that's dangerous. I think getting to the bottom of it, instead of spending millions of dollars on investigating long COVID, which, probably needs some investigation, I'm worried that the profession is not going to pursue this like they should. And that's what frightens me the most, because this is frightening. This many young cardiac events being underreported, but they are being reported by conservative media. But I'm worried about the scientific community, the medical community not pursuing.
And do the doctors that I'm just curious, do they really think at this point still that a cloth mask on a patient, for example, in the waiting room is helping to reduce COVID?
No. Anyone who does it is because of an institutional rule.
Right. The hospitals, I know, make people, and the hospitals are
they're
basically owned and run by the government and the regulators. So, yeah.
Or nowadays you have a lot of employee physicians. They're part of their hospital employees or employee of a large medical group, and that's what dictates those kind of things.
Yeah. Thank you for the call.
For calling in.
Yeah. Another doctor may have a different opinion, which as doctors often do.
Whenever this happens, by the way, Clay, I always would be like, okay, so my shoulder hurts a little bit, Doc. Start getting some free advice.
But it's funny you mentioned that, Buck. Like, I was talking to my father-in-law. We were out skiing, and he's 78, great skier, still all over the slopes, fantastic. And he said he had a knee issue, and he went to a bunch of different doctors, and they were like, some said it was a hip, some said it was a back, some said it was a knee. My point on this is, if you have an issue in your own life, how often have you gone to a doctor and gotten conflicting and contradictory opinions about what might be causing it? Because science is inexact, and we oftentimes have to examine it to come to truth. That's what the scientific method is.
I'm just waiting for Fauci to come out and say, you know what they really call a second opinion? Doubt of science.
I will say this. You were talking about quotes earlier, Buck. That's really a great line. One of my buddies used to say, you never get a second opinion from a good result, right? If you go in the doc's like, you're going to be fine, you got no issues at all. This certainly happens in the world of sports all the time when guys get injured. You never go get a second opinion when the doc says you're going to be perfectly fine and you don't need surgery. Generally speaking, you don't. Dr. Dennis in Annapolis, Maryland, ER physician. What do you think about what Dr. Frank just said, Dr. Dennis?
I disagree in that you did cover commotio cordis, which is good. And, that's an extremely rare event. But I feel that the commotio cordis, the way you explained it, is roughly correct. It causes a irregular heart rhythm or dysrhythmia at the moment of the impact at the right time in the cardiac electrical cycle. But you get one of three abnormal rhythms from the impact from that. You get what we call ventricular tachycardia with a pulse, ventricular cardia without a pulse, or ventricular fibrillation. So I suspect that he had the ventricular tachycardia moment very quickly with a pulse. That it enabled him to stand up briefly, and then his rhythm deteriorated to the either ventricular tachycardia without a pulse or ventricular fibrillation. At which time the automatic external defibrillator was applied and shocked him out of his abnormal rhythm.
So you do not believe that the COVID shot could in any way have impacted Damar Hamlin's incident?
No. Listen, I am definitely not a fan of the COVID vaccines. In fact, I characterize them as vaccine light. So I think they were marginally effective at best.
Yeah, it sounds like they're almost like a Tamiflu or something, like a therapeutic, like maybe kind of help, but we don't really know, and we'll see.
Yeah, they're just not effective like the vaccines we got when we were children, when we were
Yeah, as we've said on this show for a while, Doctor, if you got like 6 measles shots and you still got the measles, you'd be like, this doesn't feel like a very good measles vaccine.
Best measles vaccine I've ever seen. Yeah, Doc, thanks for calling in. Appreciate the other point of view on that one. And yeah, to be clear, neither you nor I pretend to know what happened. We're just asking here's what we know.
And we just opened it up right there, Buck. Those are two very reasoned guys, neurosurgeon, ER physician, with differing opinions on what might have been the cause there. And my point on this, and I think it's significant, is Fauci has such little moral authority based on getting everything wrong that when he says to me, you can't talk about this, I immediately think, oh, there's something to this. We've got to talk about this.
Yeah. Anytime Fauci wants to shut something down, you got to open it up as wide as he can. You got to get his little hands off of it. Don't let him shut it down. That's what he wants to do all the time.